If real-world politics and US aren't a factor, could Australia withstand a hypothetical Chinese attack? Chinese armed forces number 2 million, dwarfing Australian 58,000. Chinese have some 2,000 various ballistic and cruise missiles. Their air forces feature 19 times more combat planes. Of course, it's the naval might that would count the most, but Australian fleet has 10 times fewer combat ships and submarines. Still, could the vast distance protect Australia from Chinese military might? While this video talks of a modern conflict, you can check out what both sides had in World War II, courtesy of War Thunder, a free military vehicle combat online game sponsoring this video. The game features an astonishing arsenal of over 1,200 historically accurate and playable tanks, aircraft, helicopters and ships from 1930s to 1990s. The September update to the game offers China as a playable nation. Not only are the World War II vehicles available, but Cold War machines which China still uses today can also be played, like the J-7 fighter or Type 69 tank. You can try out various Australian systems, such as the Boomerang fighter or Leander-class cruiser. The game is free to play. It is also cross-platform between PC, PS4 and Xbox One. So check out War Thunder, I like it a lot, and the sponsor is offering a premium tank, aircraft or ship and 3 days of premium account time if you register via the link in the description below. So give the game a try! But let us get back to the Chinese invasion. With technological advances of the recent decades, China has overtaken the Aussie forces in number of high-tech systems as well. Yet, even with all that military might, the Chinese first have to bring their forces to Australia in order to attack it. First order of business would be to ensure the Chinese invasion fleet actually gets to Australia alive. Chinese have a problem there. If they're to just go down the straightest route, their fleet, vast as it may be, would get intercepted by Australian aircraft. Even though on paper China has many more planes, they have only one aircraft carrier, so in actual local terms, near Australian coast, Chinese would be outnumbered. Granted, a second Chinese carrier is very close to being commissioned, but even if that happens within a month, the crew isn't ready and trained, and there's been no indication that an air wing exists, let alone that it is ready and trained. So it's more likely that second carrier would not serve as an actual aircraft carrier before 2021 or so, and would thus be used as a helicopter carrier for assaults and ocean or anti-submarine patrols, as those crews could be moved out to the carrier more easily. So what routes would be available to the Chinese? Since Australia doesn't get US help, China would either have to go around third-party countries' borders or forcefully go over their airspace. That means the Strait of Malacca is off-limits to the Chinese, as it's controlled by 3 different countries. Also, looking at Indonesian territorial sea borders, it becomes apparent Chinese fleet would have to go far east to avoid it. But going that route means crossing over 5,000 miles just in one direction. While ships could go that far if supported, it becomes very hard for aircraft and missiles to go down a similar route. Even with in-air refueling, Chinese planes simply cannot reach that far in meaningful capacity. Chinese might have the option of trying to forcefully sail their ships through Indonesian archipelago, but it's unlikely such a move would be worth the effort. With countless islands and narrow gaps between them, any possible Chinese ship would face sea mines, missiles and even artillery rounds fired from the land. That's without even going into dealing with the Indonesian Navy, which, while smaller than Chinese, is still numerous enough that hiding around small islands could pose a continued threat. Indonesian submarines, while not top of the line, are also perfect for ambushes on that route. On home turf, Indonesian Navy would have better availability of their ships in the combat theater compared to China, which would have to sail a few thousand miles just to get to the fight. China would have to invest considerable assets into just controlling the Indonesian seas, probably requiring taking control of certain islands along the route and turning the whole conflict into a full-blown war against Indonesia. And in order to sustain the invasion of Australia, such routes would have to be kept secure for over a year or more, taking up dozens of ships and hundreds of aircraft that could otherwise be used against Australia. What would be doable for China, though, is forcing their way over Indonesian airspace. That would shorten the distance their bombers and missiles need to cross. Indonesian air defenses are a modest threat to the Chinese. While most of the air defense assets are shoulder-launched SAMs that can't reach the altitudes the Chinese would fly at, A few ships and land batteries could pose some threat. Then again, with a huge area of Indonesia, it's unlikely many Chinese planes would get to fly over those SAMs. A more serious threat would be Indonesian Air Force. It numbers some 40 proper fighters and several dozen trainer-class planes. The latter might pose some threat against patrol planes and transport planes, which Chinese would have to use a lot. Indonesia would have several routes to defend over a large area, so it's likely Chinese incursions would never be threatened by more than a dozen or two planes. China has a vast fleet of satellites that could somewhat monitor the relocations of Indonesian air forces. But Chinese would still have to waste 24 planes or more for each serious entry through the Indonesian airspace, to fire cruise missiles from their H-6 bombers or send early warning and maritime patrol planes, transport planes, etc. Another route that would be likely is through Papua New Guinea. It would shorten the trip a little bit and there would be barely any threat. Papua New Guinea has but a token military force and no combat navy, air defense or air force to speak of. But what is even needed to perform an invasion on Australian mainland? China couldn't afford a heavily opposed landing. Even with all the landing fleet China has, the numbers would be but a fraction of what Australia could respond with. Transport by air would be hard to do, as current Chinese transport planes lack in-air refueling option. Only larger Illusions and Y-20s could help with paradrops. But going over Indonesia with precious paratroopers would first require weeks of hunting down Indonesian air forces to minimize the risk of interception, and still a sizable fighter escort with every overflight. Flights would not go unnoticed. Australia has several early warning over-the-horizon radars. While they can't identify contacts, they would surely pick up large formations of planes or ships. They're also sufficiently far away from Australian coastline that most of them are safe from missile strikes. China currently lacks submarine-launched long-range cruise missiles, but does have a dozen or so ships which may be carrying several useful missiles per ship. What China would likely do is use vehicle launchers set up on various ships, possibly commercial ones. Both US and China trained for similar concepts, and Chinese could reach quite a bit into Australia from such ships. Still, those ships themselves would be under some threat, and even if a few hundred missiles are fired, with all the other important targets, number of missiles hitting the radars may not be enough to repeatedly inflict damage to the radar network. Over-the-horizon radars are huge sites, each covering hundreds of meters, so replacing damaged components would not be out of the question. Australia would rely on other assets as well, primarily aerial sensors, tasked with trying to track those incoming Chinese fleets and provide enough warning. If China goes over Indonesia, route might be open for Australian cruise missile strikes on those Chinese South China Sea island bases. In-air refueled F-18s could thus keep those bases harassed for several days or weeks. Chinese have very long-ranged air-launched cruise missiles, but those come with their own issues. Only H-6K bombers can carry them. Most of them have barely the range to use them on northern edges of Australia. There is a very small number of H-6 bombers in active service that can receive fuel in air, so Chinese could not perform a rain of missiles on multitude of targets at once. Blocking most of Australian air bases and converted airports simultaneously would not really work. Most Chinese conventional ballistic missiles lack range to reach Australia. Only DF-26 reaches some of Australia, and even that requires launches from the contested Chinese islands in the South China Sea. All of their longer-range models are strategic missiles with nuke warheads only, and nuclear weapons are outside the scope of this video. China could try to repeat the trick with loading the missile launcher vehicles on ships and getting a bit closer. China would also very much go for all the distant Australian islands, as those can act as aircraft bases, means to get more fighter planes than Australia in the region. And once that happens, Chinese Navy might slowly inch towards Australian coast. While there are many islands out there, 3 are particularly interesting, as they are far away from Australia, so Aussies would need a lot of resources to protect them, yet they offer favorable landscape and existing infrastructure. Chinese would likely try a two-pronged approach. Coco and Christmas Islands might see ballistic missile strikes and limited cruise missile strikes, coupled with strikes by short-range land attack missiles from nuclear submarines. Going all around Australia with slow conventional subs that hold limited supplies is a no-go. Yet Chinese nuclear-fueled subs could sail at a great speed and with roughly 90 days of endurance could be very useful around those islands. Chinese nuke sub-fleet isn't large, but compared to Australian assets, it might be a serious factor. Roughly a third of the fleet might be available on station near the islands. And the 094 class would not likely be used in offensive actions, but as silent sensors to aid in early warning of incoming threats. Australia would have to divide their assets to two very distant war theaters, and also keep some for protection of northern mainland, as well as to keep Chinese from going for Tasmania. China going for Norfolk Island in particular means most of Australian Navy would need to go there as well, if there's a chance of stopping the Chinese. Australians could keep the planes on the outer islands and risk getting them destroyed or trapped underground by missile strikes. Or they could send them from the mainland, but in that case only a small number of planes could be on station, negating Australian numerical advantage. Australian air tanker fleet is fairly modest. Two-thirds of it might hope to offload fuel for some 50 or so planes, and planes without refueling would not have the persistence for fighter patrol, but they may be used for strikes on maritime threats. Chinese force going for Cocos and Christmas Islands would have it equally hard. They would face some losses from Indonesia, including tankers which would have to refuel planes over Indonesian territory. Chinese air tanker fleet is fairly small, and supporting the fighters going for Western Islands, most jets would need to receive fuel twice, so they're likely to allow for strike packages of a few dozen planes at a time. Even then, their persistence over the islands would be short. It would be comparable to Australian planes sent from the mainland, or much less if Aussies risk and base their planes on Western Islands. Aussie Super Hornets could likely more than hold their own against any Chinese plane, short of the stealthy J-20s. F-35s are even better, but there are very few of them. Australian fleet capable of air defense is not numerous. Two newest destroyers offer long-range protection, and 9 more frigates offer limited area protection. Australia would also rely on its fleet of anti-submarine helicopters, operated from those islands or even from flat tops if needed, in addition to potent Orion and Poseidon ASW planes. Still, those fleets would be divided between a few theaters. That being said, 10 such aircraft and helicopters patrolling the seas would make the life of Chinese nuke subs very complicated, negating much of their edge. Still, the Chinese would be coming in numbers, and Australian planes and ships would slowly get attrited, so the outer islands would surely see invasion attempts. Tune in to our next week's video to see how would the invasion of those islands and possibly Australia proper go for the Chinese. And remember, Binkov may talk about hypothetical wars, but only real peace can bring us all together.